When you retire, everything changes, and that includes your investment. The number one fear that most retirees have is running out of money. Today, we're going to begin talking about investing for retirement, specifically the risks that are involved. Thanks for tuning in. If we haven't met before, I'm Mike Potter, certified financial planner professional and owner of True Wealth Financial. I believe that retirement should be prosperous, enjoyable, and purposeful. And a lot of people dream about retirement, but they find the actual transitioning into it or the path into retirement to be complex, confusing, and challenging. And I get it. It's kind of all new. You've never done it before. So it makes sense. I help Christians create and optimize a retirement plan so that they can retire with confidence. This month on the True Wealth Show, we're going to begin talking about investing, specifically as it relates to retirement or transitioning into retirement. Today, we're going to talk about risk specifically. Next week, we're going to talk about the 3 jobs that your investments have in retirement. We're going to then talk about how to create a personalized asset allocation. And we're going to wrap up the month talking about asset location, not allocation, but location, specifically the tax impacts, the availability and flexibility you have, and what happens death. Today, we're going to begin talking about the risks of retirement. We're going to talk about the general risks that really everybody has in investing. We're going to talk about the new risks that develops as you approach retirement. And I'm going to give you an example of how this risk impacts your retirement and specifically your retirement income over time. Now, in years past, I've done a presentation of the 4 keys to investing, and I've done that many, many times. And I'm not going to go through all that, but to summarize it, there's really 4 keys to investing. And this is applicable for everybody. It's think long-term. And I say that even as a retiree, even as you're in your 50s and in your 60s, you still have to have that mindset of thinking long-term. This is some portion of this money needs to last me in my 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? So think long-term is key number 1. Slow and steady, number 2. Start early is number 3. And understand risk versus reward. And the idea of that last one is the idea that the bigger the risk, the bigger the potential returns. And I say potential because there is no such thing as a guaranteed as it pertains to investing, right? So obviously on one side of the spectrum, there's like a savings account or a CD, very, very low risk, but very, 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 very low return as well. On the other end spectrum is, the scratch off lottery, the $1 billion Powerball, right? Where I put $1 or $5, whatever the Powerball costs. I don't know. I don't really play it. And I win, I've seen a couple of them over $1 billion before, right? And so obviously very, very high returns, but very, very high risk as well. Literally, when you play a scratch off or when you buy a lottery ticket, you're basically kissing that money goodbye. So now, when we're in accumulation, what we want to do is we want to get far enough down the spectrum to get a good return, but not too far to get a risk. Because inherently, there are 2 different types of risks that apply to everybody, specifically in accumulation. Accumulation is when we're saving money for retirement. We're saving for that long term. We're in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. These risks apply. The first one is what we generally think of when we think of retirement or risk in general is principal risk. The idea that I put in $1,000 and I come back at some point later in the future and now I only have $900. Now, the reality is that just because it's down doesn't mean you lost money. And conversely, just because it's up doesn't mean you gained money. You only lock in your gains or losses when you sell. But the idea of principal risk is I put in a certain amount and I come back later in the future and it's down in value, right? I lost my principal, the amount I put in went down. And that is where, if we're too high in that spectrum, too high of the risk, then it's gone. The lottery ticket, for example, I put in my $5 Powerball ticket, I get nothing back. That is principal risk. I have lost my principal, the money that I put in. Conversely, though, at the other side of the spectrum is what we call inflation risk or purchasing power risk. And that's the idea that over the long term, inflation generally runs 3 to 4% every year. So if I take money and I put in an investment, I come back a year later and it hasn't made at least 3 or 4%, hasn't kept up with inflation, I inherently have lost money. the dollar that I put in can't buy a dollar's worth of goods a year later, and I have lost money. Now, people don't think about that as losing money, but you have lost the ability to purchase what you could have a year ago for the same amount of money. So when we're investing, the key is to get far enough up the stream above the 3-4%, but not so far where we're hitting principal risk and we're losing money. Generally speaking, what I believe is that mutual funds and ETFs basically give us that mix of getting enough risk to get some return, but not too much where we're losing money. But as we transition into retirement, not only do we have those two risks still at play, but now we enter a third one as well. And this is a risk that we didn't have when we were accumulating. When we're going up the mountain, when we're building wealth, this risk didn't occur. It wasn't there. It didn't really matter to us. And I'll show you that. Or maybe it mattered, but it didn't play as much of an impact, I should say. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. But when we're going down the mountain, this risk is very important. And we call this sequence of returns risk. The sequence of returns. So the idea of what is the sequence of the market's going to do over the next 20 to 30 years as you're going into retirement. And of course, you have no idea. Like last year, the S&P did like 23, 24% or so, which is great for everybody. The year before, 20%. We had two 20% back-to-back years, which is great. But what's 2025 going to bring? We don't know. What's 2026 going to bring? We don't know, right? And so anybody who does, by the way, is lying because they don't really know. They can project and they can guess and they can hope and they can speculate, but no one knows for sure. And a great example of that is Q1 of 2020. No one in their right mind would have said the market was going to crash in Q1 of 2020 when this thing called COVID hit. Right? Nobody could predict that. So we don't know what the future might bring. We know what the long term is going to be over the course of the long term, decades long. Generally speaking, markets always go up, but we don't know the specifics of any given year. And so the sequence of those, especially as you're pulling money out, plays a large role in the portfolio in general. So I want to jump over into Money Guide Pro I did this a couple of weeks ago on a show unpacking Monte Carlo examples, but I just want to show you a couple of different run-throughs of a simulation of how we get different sequences of returns and we don't know what that is and the impact on the portfolio. So let's transition to that now. So we're in Money Guide Pro here, and I just want to help illustrate the idea of what we mean by a sequence of returns. So this is 1,000 different trials. We did a whole episode on this a couple weeks ago on the probability of success and understanding Monte Carlo. You can go back and look at that. But essentially what we have here is we have a return. So we have an investment of $500,000, and we can see what happens is this is a sequence. So this is a couple of up years, and down below here essentially is what is happening to their portfolio. So as the market goes up, the portfolio goes up. As it comes down one year, their portfolio goes down. And so that is a sequence of returns. It could be what happens. We have no idea. If we go over here to a different sequence of returns, now we have one up year, the portfolio goes up, followed by two down years. So we have some down, and then we have another up. We have an up year where the portfolio goes down a little bit because they're pulling money out, another big down year, and then a couple up years, right? So this sequence of what is up and down, what's the magnitude of it being up or the magnitude of being it down, the frequency of it is called a sequence of return. And that sequence has a large role in how much money you actually have in your portfolio over time. This is a 25 to 30 year time frame here, right? So the best one, for example, this best sequence is there's only one down year, 20 something years in the future, and they end up with $13 million. A very, very poor example is the idea that they get hit with 5 bad markets right when they retire, and essentially they're out of money within 7 years of retirement. So this is what we mean by a sequence of returns, and you can see that sequence plays a large role in the value of the portfolio. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of what sequence of returns means. But let's take it a step farther and try to apply that to an example to see the direct impact of it. But first, if you're finding this information helpful or valuable, please hit the like button. It'll let me know to do more shows like this. Plus, it's a great way to say thank you. So what I want to do here is unpack a little bit of an example just to illustrate this concept a little bit. So here I pulled the market returns from macrotrends.com for the S&P. We're going to use that as our benchmark investment as an illustration. And specifically what we're going to do is take a snapshot of the decade of 2000 to 2010, just as an example of a market decade, right? And it could be, we could have used any decade we want to, but we'll use that one as a good illustration. So this shows you the market returns going all the way back to the beginning of time, if you will, from the S&P perspective. And you can see two things. You can see that there are years where it's up and that there are years where it's down. And there are years where it's really up and there are years that it's really down. But notice the trend that overall, there are more up years than there are down years. On a general decade, the market goes up 7 years and down 3. Generally, that's a general norm, right? But our gains outweigh our quote unquote losses. Now, in the decade of the 2000 to 2010, that was an anomaly. We actually had 4 down years. 2008, and 9 was obviously a very, very bad year. But this was also what's called the lost decade, meaning that the money you had in 2000, January 1st, it was actually less than you had a decade later, right? From a value perspective, you didn't gain money over the long term. Now, if you're putting money in, you still gain because you basically bought on those 2 dips throughout there. But what I want to do now is kind of transition into Excel just to show you of how the sequence of returns impact. So here's what we're going to do. Here's the outlay of all the years and the returns. And I'm going to contrast that by basically flipping them. So, 2000, we're going to put as 2010, 2001, we're going to put as 2009. We're going to invert them just to show you how a different sequence would result in a different result on the portfolio. So let's jump into that example now. So here from macrotrends.net, I have all the returns of the S&P dating back to the beginning of time, essentially up until even a couple of days into this year. And what we're going to concentrate really is this decade right in here from 2000 to 2010. So essentially what we're going to do is let's simulate the idea. Let's say the beginning of the decade, you have $500,000 in your account. And this is the actual returns that take place. And so when you're in accumulation, if you're not adding anything or taking anything out, if you just have money in there, lump sum, you can see that regardless of the sequence of returns, so this is the actuals and this is them in reverse, right? We end up with the same amount of money because if we're not adding money or taking money out, it really doesn't matter, right? So sequence of returns when you have a lump sum value don't apply at all. But once we start adding cash flows, money either going in or coming out, that changes the equation. So here's an example. We have $500,000 in the account, but we're going to add $40,000 every year. And so this is the actual returns that took place. So we started with 500,000, we added 40, and every year at the end of the decade, we had $766,000, which is why I say if it's a lost, quote unquote, the lost decade, but if you put money in, you're ahead overall, even though the market wasn't up, because when you were putting money in, you were buying on those dips through both of those times in the early 2000s as well as 2008, 2009. But if we reverse the sequence, then you can see we end up with less money. The reason why we end up with less money is because when you're accumulating, the lower the values occur, like these 3 years here, we had down markets, we were buying on sale. And then that money essentially grew all these, then it went down a little bit here, right? So when your money is accumulating, you want to see those down markets because you're buying at a discount. Whereas on this thing, when we reversed it, basically you're buying, you got a good discount there, but then you're buying in all these up markets and then it went down again. So you actually end up with less money. But when you're taking money out, so in this case, we have $500,000 in and we're taking out $40,000 every year at the beginning of the year. And then the market goes down and here's our balance at the end of the year. So after the actual events occurred, right, we only have $4,000 left. So essentially, if we had 2010 on there, they would be out of money. 1 decade in retirement, they would be out of money. And this example here, again, we reversed the sequence of returns, start with 500,000, they're taking $40,000 out, and you can see that they have more money. And the reason why is This one is lower because they got hit early in the first couple of years of down markets. What kind of market you retire into if you're taking money out plays a large role, right? So the later down markets is better. Earlier markets hurt the portfolio, increasing more risk, right? They have less money over time than this one. This one could go maybe another year or two, whereas this example here would be out of money. So hopefully that helps you understand the impacts of the portfolio even more as you're pulling money out. So hopefully you can understand now how sequence of returns plays a large impact on your portfolio, specifically even more so when you're pulling money out. And honestly, in this example, if you're taking $40,000 out, we didn't account for the tax impacts, federal and state. So that would be even more that you're taking out if it was in a taxable account. Now, in the future, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to mitigate this a little bit. And there's two ways to do that. One from a planning perspective in our resilience, right? So we have four types of plans. We have our defined plan. We have our feasible plan. We have a resilient plan. And then we have our optimized plan, right? So an resilient strategy is to actually stress test this to see how it will do in a down market or a adverse market conditions within the first couple of years. We'll do a show on that in the future. Next week, I actually want to show you a strategy to mitigate some of this risk. It's not going to get rid of all of it, but a way to go about, the way to think about, approach your investing in retirement that can help mitigate this a little bit. Today, we talked about the risks of investing specifically as you approach retirement. If you're still with me and find this information helpful and valuable, consider subscribing. Investing involves risks. And if you're like most people, you're going to need some income for your investments. And even if you don't need it initially, over time, as inflation continues to go up, you're going to have to pull it out. And if you don't, the government eventually is going to make you pull it out if it's in a pre-taxable account. Understanding this new risk of sequence returns will greatly help you as you create a retirement income that will hopefully last a lifetime. Now, ideally, this should be done in conjunction with an overall comprehensive retirement plan, one that accounts for savings and debt, taxes, insurance, estate planning, retirement income, the whole gamut. If you don't have a good retirement plan, a good first step might be for you to engage in a True Wealth assessment. It's a financial checkup of sorts. We'll give you an assessment of where you stand holistically, give you access to right capital, and a one-page plan of recommendations that you can do to improve your journey into retirement. If you already have a good retirement plan, a good first step might be this week, if you can, to go ahead and stress test your market returns. What would happen 2 years in retirement if you have a market crash? We'll talk about how to do that a little bit later in a couple of episodes. Remember, when you retire, new risks enter as it pertains to your investment. Hopefully this helps you on your path to a prosperous, enjoyable, and purposeful retirement. Till next time, hope you have a great day. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this week's episode of the True Wealth Financial Show. I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Additionally, you can find more information on our website at www.truewealth.show. One final note, though, as we wrap up to today's show. While I hope the information was helpful, valuable, and insightful, it's really for information and educational purposes only. Prior to making any decisions or taking any actions, I'd strongly encourage you to talk to your legal, tax, estate, or financial advisor who's familiar with the unique circumstances of your particular personal situation. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, hope you have a great day.